After a year spent immersed in the breathtaking landscapes and rich spiritual traditions of Nepal, I finally set foot back home, eager to reclaim the life I had temporarily left behind. The past 12 months had been an adventure of self-discovery, trekking through the Himalayas, studying under Buddhist monks, and experiencing a culture vastly different from my suburban American neighborhood. The peace and wisdom I had gained in Nepal made me feel ready to face whatever awaited me at home. But as I turned the corner onto my street, dragging my well-worn suitcase behind me, a creeping sense of unease settled over me. My house was still there, at least, the structure was, but something was drastically wrong. My once lush, carefully tended backyard, which I had cultivated for years, had been stripped bare. In its place stood rows of neatly arranged memorial markers, each bearing names I didn't recognize. A graveyard. I blinked hard, as if I had walked onto the wrong property, but no, this was my home. The deep red Japanese maple I had planted when I first bought the house was gone. The herb spiral I had painstakingly built, a feature I had proudly maintained, was now nothing but a memory. The eerie quiet of the scene sent a chill through me, a stark contrast to the vibrant life that had once thrived here. It was in that moment, standing on the edge of what used to be my garden, that I realized something was horribly, inexcusably wrong. I stormed up to my front door, hoping that perhaps there was an explanation, some kind of clerical error, a miscommunication. But my key didn't fit. My locks had been changed. Panic rose in my chest as I pounded on the door, but no answer came. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, some with wary expressions, others with pity. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from my best friend, Alan, who had been watching over my property while I was away. "Call me ASAP. It's about the HOA." I stepped back from my own front porch, rage simmering beneath my confusion, and dialed his number. Alan picked up immediately. "Dude, I was wondering when you'd be back," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "It's bad, man. Karen Thompson and the HOA pulled some serious crap while you were gone. They claimed your property was abandoned, even though I kept sending them proof that you were still paying dues and taxes. They just took it." My fingers curled into fists. I had left detailed records, notified the HOA before leaving, ensured my mortgage was paid on time. None of it mattered. Karen, the power-hungry president of the Homeowners Association, had orchestrated a hostile takeover of my property under the false pretense of abandonment. The HOA had not only claimed my home, but they had desecrated my garden and transformed my backyard into a graveyard without my knowledge or consent. And now, I was locked out of my own house. Anger churned inside me as I stormed around to the backyard, my footsteps crunching against the freshly turned soil where my garden used to be. My beautiful, flourishing space, gone. I had spent years curating that garden, selecting every plant with care. The Japanese maple had been a gift from my grandfather, a connection to my family's past. The herb spiral, with its carefully arranged tiers of rosemary, thyme, and lavender, had been a source of both sustenance and solace. Now, all of it had been erased. In its place were tombstones, dozens of them. Some bore dates and names stretching back decades, while others looked fresh, as if the HOA had recently sold new burial plots. I knelt down, running my fingers over the engraving of one of the newer stones. Something about it felt off. The names didn't belong to anyone I knew in the neighborhood. And yet, according to the inscriptions, they had been laid to rest right here, in what used to be my garden. My pulse quickened. Who were these people? Had Karen and the HOA actually buried bodies here? A sickening realization washed over me. If they had gone this far, what else had they done? I needed answers. And more importantly, I needed my home back. Determined to find proof of the HOA's wrongdoing, I began pacing the backyard, scanning for any evidence that could help me reclaim my property. That's when I noticed a stack of dirt-covered folders haphazardly piled near the edge of my fence. Curious, I knelt down and picked one up, brushing off the dust. My breath caught in my throat as I read the faded label, Federal Bureau of Investigation, classified. My hands trembled as I flipped it open. Inside were yellowed pages filled with technical schematics, crime scene analysis reports, and handwritten notes. The date on the earliest document was 1946. My grandfather's name, Dr. William Carter, was printed at the top of several pages. I felt a chill run down my spine. My grandfather had always been a brilliant forensic scientist, a pioneer in crime scene investigation, but he had never spoken much about his work with the government. And yet, here was undeniable proof that he had been deeply involved with the FBI. More than that, these documents suggested that his work had laid the foundation for modern forensic science as we knew it. My heart pounded. Why had these files been buried beneath my backyard? And how had the HOA unknowingly unearthed them during their illegal excavation? The deeper I delved into the files, the more I realized the magnitude of what I had uncovered. My grandfather hadn't just been a scientist. He had been a key figure in revolutionizing forensic science, developing methods that were still in use by the FBI today. His notes detailed early techniques for fingerprint analysis, ballistics matching, and even rudimentary forms of DNA testing long before they became standard practice. But what shocked me the most was a legal document buried within the stack, one that confirmed my grandfather had retained intellectual property rights to many of these forensic methods. That meant the FBI had been using his work for decades, without compensating our family. A sense of awe and anger twisted inside me. This wasn't just about reclaiming my home anymore. This was about justice, for my grandfather, for my family, and for everyone who had ever been wronged by people who thought they could rewrite history. The HOA had unknowingly unearthed something far bigger than their petty land grab. And now, they were about to face the consequences. As I sat among the scattered FBI documents, a grim realization settled over me. The HOA hadn't just overstepped their authority, they had violated multiple federal laws. The unauthorized excavation of my property wasn't just a case of trespassing. It was a blatant violation of historical preservation laws, desecration of potential human remains, and, worst of all, illegal sales of burial plots without proper permits. My fists clenched at the sheer audacity of it all. Karen Thompson and her cronies had treated my backyard like a business opportunity, capitalizing on the space without a single shred of legal authority. I didn't even want to imagine how many grieving families had unknowingly purchased burial sites from them, believing it was legitimate. I needed evidence to expose their crimes, and as I searched through the graveyard, I found it, a stack of documents stuffed inside a rusting metal filing cabinet hidden behind a row of tombstones. Inside were forged property transfer papers, fraudulent HOA meeting minutes, and even receipts for memorial plot sales that detailed how much money they had pocketed from the scam. It was damning evidence, enough to dismantle the entire HOA's leadership. But even with this, I knew I needed reinforcements. This was bigger than a simple legal dispute. This was a full-blown crime. And if the FBI wasn't already interested in my property because of my grandfather's work, they would with the classified documents in hand and undeniable proof of the HOA's criminal activity. I dialed the number of the nearest FBI field office. The phone barely rang twice before a voice answered. Special Agent Jackson, FBI. Who am I speaking with? I took a deep breath. My name is Daniel Carter. I just returned home after a year abroad and found my property illegally seized by my HOA. But that's not why I'm calling. There was a pause. Go on. During their unauthorized excavation, they uncovered classified FBI documents that belonged to my grandfather. He was a forensic scientist who worked for the Bureau in the 1940s, and I have proof that some of the forensic methods the FBI still uses today were legally owned by him. Another silence, but this one was different, charged, tense. You're saying classified federal documents were discovered on your property? Yes, and I have them in my possession right now. Don't move, Jackson ordered, his voice firm. I'm sending a team to your location immediately. Within the hour, black SUVs rolled onto my street, and agents in dark suits filed out, their eyes scanning my backyard with careful scrutiny. Special Agent Jackson, a tall man with graying hair and an air of quiet authority, approached me. He barely spared a glance at the graveyard before turning to me with a sharp gaze. Show me what you found. Karen Thompson had ruled the HOA with an iron fist for years, bullying homeowners into compliance and pushing her own agendas with little resistance. But this time, she had overreached. As the FBI agents swarmed my property, inspecting the illegal burial plots and classified files, Karen arrived, wearing her usual smug expression. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, striding toward me as if she still had any authority over my land. I crossed my arms, barely restraining a smirk. "Oh, just a federal investigation into your illegal activities." The color drained from her face as she finally noticed the badges, the forensic teams marking off sections of my backyard, and the serious expressions of the agents. "There must be a mistake," she stammered. "The HOA had every right to repurpose this land. It was abandoned." Agent Jackson stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We have documentation proving otherwise. Not only did you seize private property under false pretenses, but you also illegally sold burial plots, forged documents, and tampered with historically significant artifacts. That alone carries serious legal consequences." Karen sputtered, trying to regain control, but it was too late. Within minutes, she was in handcuffs, her reign of terror over the neighborhood brought to an abrupt and humiliating end. As she was led to a waiting FBI vehicle, I could see my neighbors peeking out from their homes, whispering among themselves. Some looked shocked, others relieved. The tyrant had finally fallen. With Karen and her corrupt allies ousted, the neighborhood faced a turning point. For too long, the HOA had been a tool of control, used to intimidate and manipulate homeowners rather than serve them. But now, with the old leadership dismantled, the power vacuum needed to be filled. Surprisingly, it was my neighbors who suggested at first I should be the new HOA president. At first, I balked at the idea. I had never wanted to be involved in HOA politics, let alone lead it. But as I looked around at my neighbors, at the people who had suffered under Karen's rule, I realized this was an opportunity. An opportunity to rebuild, to make things right. Under my leadership, the illegal graveyard was transformed into a proper memorial garden, with families given the option to relocate their loved ones to a legitimate cemetery at no cost. The remaining graves were documented, preserved, and honored with dignity. The fraudulent fees Karen had collected were returned to the families she had scammed. And most importantly, the HOA was restructured to ensure transparency, fairness, and community involvement. No more backdoor deals. No more unchecked power. For the first time in years, our neighborhood felt like a true community. As the FBI completed their investigation and the dust settled, one undeniable truth remained. My grandfather's legacy was far greater than I had ever known. His contributions to forensic science had shaped modern criminal investigations, and the discovery of his documents shed new light on forensic history. The Bureau, recognizing the importance of his work, proposed an idea: a museum dedicated to my grandfather's contributions, built right here on my property. At first, the thought overwhelmed me. My home had already been at the center of so much upheaval. But as I stood in my backyard, looking at the place where my garden once flourished, I realized that this was the best way to honor my grandfather's work. With the FBI's backing and community support, construction began on a small museum and research center, showcasing my grandfather's forensic breakthroughs and their impact on modern criminal justice. The museum quickly became a point of pride for the neighborhood and drew visitors from across the country. Scientists, law enforcement officers, even students eager to learn about the origins of forensic science. What had once been a crime scene, a battleground, was now a place of learning and remembrance. It was a testament not only to my grandfather's brilliance but to the resilience of a community that had refused to let corruption win. As the FBI completed their analysis of my grandfather's documents, a startling legal reality emerged. My family still held intellectual property rights to many of the forensic methods that the FBI had been using for decades. The implications were staggering. My grandfather's early innovations in fingerprint analysis, ballistic forensics, and trace evidence collection had formed the backbone of modern forensic science, and yet, the government had never formally secured the rights to use them. Agent Jackson approached me with a mix of professionalism and quiet respect. "The Bureau recognizes the importance of your grandfather's contributions," he said. "We'd like to negotiate a licensing agreement to ensure his work is properly acknowledged." It was a surreal moment. Just days ago, I had been locked out of my own home, battling a corrupt HOA. Now, I was sitting in a high-rise conference room with a team of FBI legal representatives, discussing royalties and intellectual property rights. After extensive negotiations, we reached an agreement. The FBI would pay my family a licensing fee for continued use of my grandfather's forensic techniques, along with retroactive compensation for past use. More importantly, his name would finally receive the historical recognition it deserved, ensuring that future generations of forensic scientists knew the foundations of their field had been built by William Carter. With the contract signed, I felt an immense sense of closure. What had begun as a nightmare had transformed into something far more profound, a long-overdue correction of hist. With the HOA's corruption exposed and justice served, the neighborhood finally began to heal. The fear and resentment that had plagued homeowners for years started to dissipate, replaced by a sense of unity and optimism. The first community meeting under my leadership felt like a rebirth. Instead of Karen's authoritarian rule, there was open discussion, laughter, and real collaboration. We dismantled the draconian policies Karen had put in place, eliminating unnecessary fines and reducing HOA fees to a reasonable level. Homeowners who had once been divided by Karen's manipulations found common ground, working together to improve shared spaces and support one another. The illegal graveyard, once a symbol of corruption, became a beautiful memorial garden where families could visit their loved ones in peace. A small monument was placed at the entrance, acknowledging both the injustice that had occurred and the resilience of the community that had reclaimed it. Even those who had once sided with Karen began to express gratitude for the changes. "I never realized how much control she had over us," one neighbor admitted. "It's like we were all just afraid to fight back." I nodded, understanding all too well. But fear no longer ruled this neighborhood. We had taken back our homes, our rights, and our dignity. Word of the scandal and subsequent transformation spread far beyond our quiet suburban neighborhood. Local news stations picked up the story first, then national outlets followed. Reports detailed how an overreaching HOA had illegally seized property, how an unsuspecting homeowner had unearthed classified FBI documents, and how a community had rallied together to overthrow corruption. It was the kind of story that captivated audiences, a bizarre mix of true crime, government conspiracy, and grassroots justice. Talk shows invited me for interviews. Legal analysts debated the implications of the FBI's licensing agreement with my family. Even forensic scientists weighed in, excited about the newfound recognition of my grandfather's work. "This discovery fundamentally changes how we view the origins of forensic science," one expert said on a primetime segment. "Dr. William Carter's contributions deserve a place in every forensic textbook." But perhaps the most surprising outcome was the impact our story had on other communities struggling with corrupt HOAs. Emails and letters poured in from homeowners across the country, sharing their own horror stories of HOA abuses. Some had faced illegal fines and forced evictions. Others had been threatened into compliance. Our victory became a beacon of hope, proving that HOA overreach wasn't inevitable, that it could be challenged, and even defeated. As the FBI continued their investigation into my grandfather's buried documents, it became clear that this was only the beginning. The files I had found were just the tip of the iceberg. Agent Jackson informed me that additional records were being uncovered, hinting at even deeper historical significance. "Your grandfather was involved in some highly classified projects," Jackson told me one evening. "Some of this goes beyond forensics. We're talking national security, Cold War intelligence, maybe even things we haven't fully pieced together yet." The thought sent shivers down my spine. What exactly had my grandfather been working on? Had he left more secrets buried beneath my home? The prospect both excited and unsettled me. As renovations for the Forensic Museum began, we uncovered a hidden compartment beneath the house's foundation, one containing yet another locked steel case. When I opened it, I found additional handwritten notes, blueprints, and what appeared to be an old reel of film. The label on the case read, "Project Equinox, Confidential." My breath caught. What was Project Equinox? The FBI would need time to analyze it, but I had a feeling this was just the beginning of something even bigger. As I sifted through my grandfather's notes, I found something that made my blood run cold. A personal letter, addressed directly to me, though he had written it decades before I was even born. "Daniel, if you are reading this, then the land has been disturbed. That means you are in danger." I read the words again, my pulse hammering. My grandfather had anticipated this moment. He had known that one day, someone would unearth his work, and that it would come with risks. The rest of the letter was cryptic, filled with warnings about people who might try to claim his research for their own purposes. He urged me to protect what was left, to guard the land, to never let certain discoveries fall into the wrong hands. What had he hidden here that was so dangerous? And more importantly, who else might come looking for it? For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt something new creeping in beneath my triumph. Not fear. Paranoia. If my grandfather's work was as groundbreaking as the FBI claimed, then it wasn't just history I was uncovering. It was a secret that someone, somewhere, had wanted to stay buried. The fight to reclaim my home and expose the HOA's corruption culminated in a high-stakes legal battle. Despite Karen Thompson's arrest, her former allies in the HOA attempted to downplay their involvement, insisting they had no knowledge of the illegal excavation and property seizure. But the evidence I had gathered, fraudulent documents, bank statements showing misused HOA funds, and testimonies from neighbors, was overwhelming. The courtroom was packed, with reporters eager to cover what had become one of the most high-profile HOA scandals in recent history. The prosecution methodically laid out the case, detailing the forged paperwork, illegal land sales, and destruction of private property. But it was the FBI's testimony that sealed the fate of the corrupt HOA board. Special Agent Jackson took the stand, confirming that the excavation had violated federal laws on historical preservation and that Karen and her associates had knowingly tampered with classified government materials. The judge didn't take long to rule in my favor. The HOA's land seizure was declared illegal, all fraudulent burial plot sales were voided, and my property was fully restored to me. Karen and the most complicit board members faced heavy fines, community service, and even potential jail time for fraud and property destruction. As I walked out of the courthouse, neighbors who had once been wary of speaking out approached me, shaking my hand, thanking me. Justice had been served, but the battle had changed me. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I had become the protector of my grandfather's legacy, and I had a responsibility to ensure his work was safe. The neighborhood's transformation didn't just stop at legal victories, it became something deeper, something personal. Neighbors who had once been divided by Karen's intimidation tactics now stood together, united in a way I had never seen before. At our first official HOA meeting under new leadership, the difference was night and day. Instead of fear and hostility, there was openness, real discussion. We rewrote the HOA's bylaws, ensuring that power would never again be concentrated in the hands of a single authoritarian figure. All financial decisions would be transparent. Homeowners would have real input in community matters. And most importantly, no one would ever be forced out of their home again. But the biggest surprise came from the very people who had once supported Karen. Some of them had been victims of her manipulation, fed lies about my so-called abandonment of the property. Now, with the truth out in the open, they approached me one by one, offering apologies, thanking me for standing up when they were too afraid to. It wasn't just my home that had been reclaimed, it was our entire neighborhood. Before all of this, I had been content living a quiet, private life. But after fighting for my home, my grandfather's legacy, and my community, something inside me changed. I had discovered a strength I never knew I had. When I first found the graveyard in my backyard, I had been overwhelmed, confused, even afraid. But now, looking back, I saw how every challenge had forced me to grow. I had stood up to corruption, faced off against powerful institutions, and even negotiated with the FBI. I wasn't the same person who had left for Nepal a year ago. I had become a leader, a historian, an advocate. And as much as I had once resisted the idea of getting involved in the HOA, I now understood the importance of having the right people in charge. If I hadn't fought back, Karen and her corrupt board would have gotten away with everything. Who else would have stood up? Maybe no one. And that thought made me realize something even more profound. Sometimes, we don't choose to be the hero of the story. The story chooses us. With the dust settling and my home finally back in my hands, I could have stepped away, let life return to normal. But I couldn't ignore the lingering questions, the ones buried beneath decades of secrecy. My grandfather's letter had warned me that if his work was disturbed, danger would follow. And now, with the Project Equinox documents in the FBI's hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface. What was so important that my grandfather had taken such great lengths to hide it? And if someone had wanted it buried, what would they do now that it had been uncovered? Late at night, as I sat in my study, poring over my grandfather's remaining notes, a realization struck me. This wasn't over. The Forensic Museum, the FBI licensing agreement, the downfall of the HOA, it was all just the beginning. Something much bigger had been set into motion, and I was standing at the center of it. I had spent the past year traveling the world, seeking adventure and meaning. I never imagined the greatest adventure would be waiting for me at home as the Forensic Museum neared completion and the community continued to rebuild. I prepared for what came next. The FBI was still investigating my grandfather's documents, but part of me wondered if they were telling me everything. There was an unspoken tension whenever I met with Agent Jackson, a feeling that there was more he wasn't saying. And then, one evening, I received an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with only 3 words written on it: "Not everything stays buried." My hands tightened around the note as I scanned the empty street. Was it a warning? A threat? Or something else entirely? I had no idea who had sent it. But I knew one thing for certain: my grandfather's secrets were far from finished with me.